On Wednesday, June 10th, 2020, Dr. Alan Tuffery gave an online seminar to members of the Humanist Association of Ireland on the subject of evolution and humanism. As a result of the COVID-19 lockdown, the Humanist Association's meetings have been moved online for the foreseeable future, but we've been delighted with the response. Huge attendances have logged in. We've had some great discussions as a result. Our speaker, Alan Tuffery, will be familiar to most HAI members. He's been an active member for years, not just of the HAI at a national level, but also as part of the North Dublin Humanist community, where, amongst other things, he convenes the book club. Before retirement, he lectured in physiology at Trinity College. In recent years, he's led several discussions for different groups of humanists around the country and on topics such as dying with dignity, humanist values, and the basis of humanist morality. So he's obviously a very deep thinker, and we were delighted to have him lead this discussion on evolution and humanism. Hopefully you enjoy it.
Anyway, good evening again. That's great to see lots of you there. This format is a bit intimidating in some ways because there's no feedback from people. Normally there's lots of rustling and eyeballing and groaning in audiences, and now I can't get any of that. So I should just plunge on. I'm also very conscious that you're all muted, and humanists are not used to just being quiet for a while. They like to contribute. And I'm a bit worried there might be an explosion. So that's why I'm going to do a stop off about halfway through to give you a space for questions and discussion. There are only about half a dozen slides. None of us wants to go death by PowerPoint. They mostly come together near the beginning, and I propose to take them off the screen when I'm not using them. There will be a handout available after the talk. I should probably finish it off tomorrow if any changes are required. And the handout will include all the slides that I use, any references that I mention, and any quotations that I use, and maybe a few quotations that I don't use. And Eamon gave you the email address. It's events@humanism.ie. If you email that, you will get the handouts in the fullness of time. To go back to a month or so ago, Eamon asked me to think about doing this talk. I was very excited by that because my original talk on evolution and humanism to HAI was in May of 2018, so almost exactly 2 years ago. Since then, I've done a lot of reading and thinking and discussing with several humanist groups around the country, from Killarney to Coleraine and from Sligo to Drogheda. And my ideas have moved on a bit, thanks to those. I want to give special thanks to my own local humanist group, the North Dublin Humanist Community, who've been very helpful, not to say very patient at times. Now, I'm interested in ideas, and especially the ideas underpinning humanism. Not everyone necessarily wants to spend much time with ideas, but I think it's satisfying and important to have a clear, coherent underlying concept for our humanist thinking. However, it's not just enough to talk about the ideas. We need to think about what kind of society and what kind of world we want. We also need to think about ways of getting there. As humanists, we base our thinking on our best understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. Nowadays, no one can assimilate all the information about new discoveries and the revisions to ideas that pour in from all sides. But a good general idea of current information will help, and I suggest that we need a big, overarching idea to give us a framework in which to think about morality, society, and global issues. And I will argue that evolution is that overarching idea. Now we come to the clever bit where I share a screen. The first slide is always the worst. Oh, sorry, I've got to. Oh, I thought I'd muted myself. I beg your pardon. It said I had. Great, there we are. This is the outline of what I'm going to say. I'll start with what do we know about ourselves and our place in the universe. and after an account of evolution and how it affects our view of ourselves, I look at some specific properties of us humans, especially the fact that we've got big brains and we are social animals. And finally, I hope to be able to show a general framework for thinking about the more pragmatic questions of how to respond to the issues around us. That's the first one gone now. Jolly good. Evolution and humanism is my theme, and Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection has been described as the greatest idea ever. It's truly revolutionary, and it changes our view of ourselves, our societies, and our world. In the first part of this talk, I'm very much following the thinking of Julian Huxley, who was one of the great proponents of evolutionary thinking in the middle of the 20th century. Now, I'm aware that Huxley is virtually unknown nowadays, but apart from being T.H. Huxley's grandson, he was an important public intellectual and humanist in the 1950s and 60s. He was also the first director of UNESCO, and as I only recently discovered, he also won an Oscar. Not a bad CV. His modern synthesis of evolution and his application to human life was deeply influential in my own development and thinking, and introduced me to the idea of humanism. I think his ideas go a long way to providing the kind of coherent framework that we're looking for. Now, Huxley called his ideas evolutionary humanism, but I have reluctantly chosen to avoid that term because it's become associated with racist theories and the Holocaust. And that appears to be the fault of Yuval Noah Harari. Harari is an Israeli historian who doesn't understand humanism in general, or perhaps he just doesn't like it. Unfortunately, he included this association with racism in his 2015 book, Sapiens, which has sold more than 1 million copies, and it's hard to battle against an influence like that. Harari is, of course, just wrong about evolutionary humanism, but in any case, the term may now be tainted beyond use, so I've given it up. I might say that his book, Sapiens, is otherwise very stimulating and useful. A pity about the humanism. Now, if we use evolution as our basic concept, our humanism will be based on an essentially scientific approach. That makes it a robust concept. That is, it's consistent with present knowledge and can always accommodate new knowledge. It shows proper scientific humility. We are not in the realm of dogma here. So let's consider what we know about ourselves. What does a rational view of the universe say about where we are? What we think we know about our universe, the Earth, our species, and ourselves? Well, the universe, not much to say about it. It's about 15 billion years old, and it's very big. You need a capital V and a capital B for that. It's very big. There are probably trillions of galaxies out there, and they are thousands of light years away, and they're going further away. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, about a third of the age of the universe, and is tucked away in a remote corner of our galaxy. Ta-da, it goes here again. There you go. This is the famous picture of Earthrise from the moon, about 200,000 kilometers away. The Earth appears as what Carl Sagan described as a pale blue dot with a patterning of cloud. It's small in the inky darkness of space. Earth is beautiful, remote, and fragile. On this scale, and the scale is the universe as a whole, humankind is fleeting and trivial, and the individual is almost as nothing. Humanism counters this existential despair and seeks to give meaning to human existence, even at the level of the individual. Huxley did this through the idea of evolution. So let's have a look at evolution and then go on to have a look at its implications. We recognized 3 stages of evolution. This slide shows 2 of them. The first stage is the inorganic stage. That is the stage when non-living things arrived. The evolution of the galaxies, the stars, the planets, and the chemical elements. The lightest elements were formed first, hydrogen and helium, and it took the collisions and explosions of stars to bang these lighter elements together to form the heavier elements, such as carbon, oxygen, iron, and all the others. This is what the astronomer Carl Sagan meant when he said that we are made of stardust. I think that's a fantastic idea. If you're not, if awe isn't inspired by that, you're on your own, I think. This stage took a very long time, the first 10 billion years or so of the universe. The second stage, the evolution of living things, he called the organic stage. Life appeared and it involved increasing complexity. From slimes and bacteria to complex organisms with trillions of cells adapted to live in different ways in different habitats. This stage has only been going on for about 4 billion years, since the Earth cooled down enough to allow some sensible chemistry. Darwin's great idea, evolution by natural selection, especially as expanded by our understanding of genetics, gives a wonderful explanation of how evolution works, how starting from the very simplest organisms, the basic fact of reproduction with variation inevitably leads to increasing complexity. Indeed, evolution by natural selection has been described as an engine for generating complexity. All this diversity of living things is often shown in a diagram called the tree of life. And here's one version. This slide shows little figures representing all the different groups of animals and plants. And crucially, in this version, they are all arranged in a triangle. The overall triangular arrangement indicates that nature is hierarchical. The so-called lower animals, such as amoeba, mushroom, and starfish, are below. The higher animals, reptiles, birds, mammals, are much higher up. You will notice that man is at the top, and that's the reason I called this the Anthropocentric view. One or two of you will have already noticed that in this diagram, man is higher up than woman. A pause for hysterical laughter and groans. I'll take that as read. This view of nature was doubtless conditioned by biblical and imperial notions of the 19th century, and was not, I think, Darwin's own view, more enlightened man. Here's another view of the tree of life on the right. I contrast the triangular anthropocentric view on the left with a more modern representation. On the right, all the living things are arranged in a circle so that the older organisms are towards the middle, and later forms, such as the vertebrates and man, are towards the outside. This version represents modern thinking. Not only are all forms related, but they are all perfectly adapted to their way of life. And in that sense, they are all equal, and there is no higher or lower, as indicated by the circular arrangement. In both images, the intention is to show that humans are a part of nature, evolved from preceding forms and sharing ancestors with all living organisms. The third stage that Huxley recognized, he called cultural evolution. And as well as the ability to create new tools, humans developed language to a unique degree. Language enabled humans to communicate their technology and ideas to other human groups. This in turn led to the formation of complex social structures with elaborate technology, art, etc. This cultural evolution has only been going on for a couple of 100,000 years, but it goes on much faster than the normal organic evolution or genetic evolution. And of course, advances in technology have meant ever increasing speeds of communication and ever faster evolution of technology, societies, and institutions. Now, note that these ideas and institutions that have evolved are themselves subject to natural selection, and they evolve and die in their turn. And here perhaps we can see the power of evolutionary thinking. It applies to every aspect of life. going to be fun. Now, here's the implications of cultural evolution. Huxley's main conclusion was that man is the sole agent of evolution on the planet. And in this sense, this recognition shows us the potential and the power to change our own lives and our destiny and that of the planets. And that gives us responsibility. This notion also places great emphasis on the importance of the individual. Every individual now has a value in the context of this evolutionary idea and involvement in our human society and what Huxley called our destiny. And this means that each human should be fulfilled and to develop themselves as far as possible. And that gives power to society and a responsibility to society to develop the individual as much as possible. So now you get your first break, and Eamon might let you in because I'm going off slides now, and we'll have a little time for you to have a little natter.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Alan. That's the first half, I believe, is it?
Just about, yeah.
Just about. So, in line with kind of a structure to meetings that we used to use back in the days where you could meet face to face, might be a good opportunity at this point to see if anyone has any immediate questions or any comments to make about what we've heard so far, rather than have people kind of sitting on their hands for the duration of the full talk and waiting to get in there with their questions. Now, as regards how the best way to do this might be, I can see, well, Francesca, you've got your hand up there. Do you want to say something?
I wanted to say that I really enjoyed the second diagram. I thought it was something like Arthur and the Round Table. All the knights were the same, you know. Yes. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that difference of the two aspects of it, rather than the triangle. I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a very telling diagram. Yes. Yes. I wish I'd made it.
Okay. Well, we'll go. I saw Peter O'Hara's hand up first, and then Bridget Carlin. So you can put your hand down as well, Bridget. Peter, do you want to unmute yourself?
Wasn't sure if that was going to work. The diagram of the Earth and the stuff with it has two mistakes. Firstly, the moon is 400,000 kilometers away, and the picture is from 1968 in Apollo 8 and is famous. There's nothing to do with the pale blue dot picture, which is by Voyager 2
Voyager 1, yeah.
in 1989, which Carl Sagan wanted to take this picture when it had passed Neptune, and it is indeed a very, very tiny blue dot. In the picture, it's very hard to see. It is very, very tiny.
Indeed, you are, of course, quite right. And I was going to show you the Voyager picture, but as you know yourself, that the tiny blue dot is so tiny that you can't see it most of the time, even on the new version of the picture.
Yeah, that's no reason to put it like that. I think that's unreasonable myself.
Very good, thank you.
Bridget, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I actually found slide 4. It was the first thing I noticed, the female figure being on the rung below. And I'm also aware that, you know, we have one dog, one cow, but we have two human beings, you know, one being less than the other. And I wonder if, like pulling down the Colston statue in Bristol recently, it isn't time to abandon diagrams like that, because it's downright offensive. The other thing that struck me was saying that man, you know, talking about man's sociability. And again, I think, you know, in the last, 70 years, we've learnt a bit more. I'm reading Overstory by Richard Powers at the minute. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It's a novel, but extremely interesting, about forests and just the sociability of a forest. That, you know, an ancient forest is not however many thousand trees. It is one whole organism passing messages through mycelium and the roots and through the air. And I wonder if talking about human beings as social animals is just us being ignorant and blind again.
I didn't say we were the only ones. There are plenty of social animals.
Yeah, right.
Go back to your diagram. I nearly mentioned you when I put that diagram because I knew you would bridle straight away. So I agree. But the beauty of the first diagram, that what I think of as the 19th century view, the imperial and Christian view, or biblical view, it does show man above woman. In the second diagram, there probably is no diagram of a human being that you can show which is not gendered. So perhaps you should just show some other primate and have done.
Yes, or a little stick person.
Ah, nice genderless stick person. I like it. Yes. Yeah. So we're so close to the chimpanzee, we might as well show a chimpanzee.
Absolutely. And often they're prettier. Apologies to George Clooney. Right, I shall unmute myself. Or rather, I'll mute myself again now.
Okay, Alan, Barbara has messaged me privately to say she loves how you explain things, demystifying complex information, and that she'd like me to thank you for that because she's too shy to do so herself, I think.
Oh, lovely, thank you.
Does anyone else want to, maybe sending a message to the chat function might be a way to get attention. I see Dara Hogan with your hand up as well. Dara, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yes, I've done that. Alan, a great start this evening, thank you. I sent Alan my question earlier because accountants aren't very hot on evolution, and we think of it as evolution over the millennia or over generations like Darwin's finches. But I asked Alan, is the annual mutation of the flu virus, is that a form of evolution?
And thanks to the fact he asked me this a week ago, the answer is fairly pat. The answer really comes, the quick answer is that you have many generations of viruses in relation to the number of generations of humans. Our generation time is what, 25 years or something like that. The generation time of viruses is probably measured in minutes or hours. So in a 12-month period, they have many variations. And however their genome is structured, it allows, on the very limited genome, it allows variability in the molecules that are on the surface of the enzyme. And it's those molecules which allow viruses to be recognized by our immune system. So by changing those, they outwit the immune system. So it's a constant battle. It's a war between viruses. Bacteria do much the same. It's a constant battle so that we can, so our immune systems battle with them, which is why we give fresh flu vaccines every year. We take a guess about which is going to be the most prevalent flu in a given season, and we get a vaccine for it, and sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. But it is a guess, and there is no surefire vaccine for everything, as we know. We know a lot about vaccines now.
You certainly do. Gary Elbert, who's a very new member, and I think he's recently joined up with Humanists West. So you want to unmute yourself, Gary?
Yeah, I just wanted to have a quick question there for Alan. I really enjoyed the introduction, Alan. It's just such an amazing story, an amazing theory. But like, I'm from a working class background, shall we say, you know, and I wonder, like, are you aware how many people are actually not aware of the basic theory of evolution? Would you actually, like, the numbers are actually massive.
I don't know of any data on this in Ireland. There's plenty of data in the US, of course, where something like 35% of the population or something don't accept the idea of evolution. But they produce some very strange results on all sorts of surveys. There may even have been some data on that in Landman's talk on unbeliefs that we heard last year. Young Turpin's colleague from the Queen's Project. But I don't know of any data here. I have actually, when I've been talking about evolution in a class, I did have somebody who was almost certainly a Muslim say, but it's only a theory. Which was a great feed line, because I said, can you wait for the next slide? Because I'm about to discuss the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. So that should deal with that for you.
Yeah, lovely.
So that was lecture 1 for a pre-university. So that was, you start with evolution. Just by way of, there is a reference which is in the handout to one of Dawkins' book, which is the best account of the evidence of evolution that I know. I don't go about reading them all. It's called The Greatest Show on Earth, and well worth a few of your hard-earned. I'll get it from the library, even better. But it's a fabulous book, and he says himself it's the book he should have written about 20 years ago. And it just sets all that, the information in a very logical and quite wonderful way, and awe-inspired way. So it's a terrific read.
Thanks, Alan. Just a kind of a tag on to the previous question. If different types of virus can produce and reproduce so fast and mutate, then what's the point of there being a vaccine in the first place? And I will say that that's not my question. I've stolen that from somebody who suggested it to me privately via the chat function. But I think
it's a perfectly good question. A vaccine, I suppose the development of vaccines shows the emphasis that why would you have a vaccine from flu if they get flu? Some flus are very dangerous, and you can be very ill very quickly. Most flus are not particularly dangerous to healthy people, but we encourage people to vaccinate. It's a hit and miss operation. I mean, I get vaccinated every year. I still got a pretty nasty flu and spent 2 days in hospital a few years ago. But, you know, ça va. That's the way it is. So yeah, I think it reflects the value on human lives.
Okay. Does anybody else want to either message on the chat function or show their hand just in case they want to say something before we move on to the second part of the talk? And my apologies. My internet, I think, connection is a bit unstable, and now I can't actually see videos of people's faces. So I hope I'm not missing anybody who's waving at me. But I guess, Alan, if you can't see anybody, perhaps we'll. Do you want to start the second half of the talk?
About 6 people anyway. Do
you want to fire ahead then?
From this point in the story, Julian Huxley, in his essay "The Humanist Frame," went on to consider ways of viewing various aspects of society, like education, art, rites and ceremonies, and many more. But I want to stay with us humans and examine the consequences of our being social animals with very big brains. In relation to our body size, we have the biggest brains of any animal, and arguably the brain is the most complex structure in the universe. Each brain has more than 85 billion nerve cells, with each cell making and receiving hundreds of connections from other nerve cells. Stephen Fry, speaking of using complex machines, said that we probably only use about 10% of the capacity of a given machine, such as a smartphone. And given the state of the world, it seems to have taken us humans a long time to find out how to use our super brains effectively. It appears that we need help to get the best use out of our brains. It doesn't come with a user's manual. Steven Pinker is an American psychologist and public intellectual. And in his 2015 book, Better Angels of Our Nature, he argues that the biggest change in humanity is the development of abstract thinking. That is, the ability to be able to see patterns of difference and similarity. Abstract thinking also allows us to conceive of things that don't exist, the future, unicorns, and even a secular state where all citizens are valued equally. But it appears that humans have been able to develop this ability only with experience of the wider world and the development of educational systems. Now, this is a very big idea to take in. So I want to pause here to look at 2 lines of evidence that Pinker adduces to show that abstract thinking has increased in recent times. The first line comes from IQ testing, and the second from cultural studies of reasoning. IQ tests have been used for over 100 years, sometimes with exactly the same questions for all of that time. The consistent finding is that there is a steady rise in average IQ over time of about 3 IQ points per decade. This is known as the Flynn effect, and it is corrected for by scaling the IQ scores so that the average is always 100. This produces some very strange conclusions. For example, someone of average intelligence who scored 100 in 1910 would nowadays be reckoned as having an IQ of 70 and would be considered as having a learning difficulty. And today's teenager would score better than 98% of the population of 1910. Now, plainly, there were some very bright people about in the past. They didn't all have learning difficulties. So what has changed? When the areas of gains in IQ scores are analysed, it turns out that the biggest gains are in abstract reasoning. Things like similarities and analogies. Questions like, what do these shapes have in common? And visual matrices. Questions like, fill in the last item in a sequence of shapes. The speed of change in average IQ means that the cause is almost certainly environmental rather than genetic. And after excluding diet and health, etc., it appears that the big change is the adoption of what Pinker calls post-scientific reasoning. Consider the question, what do dogs and rabbits have in common? The post-scientific answer is that they are both mammals. The pre-scientific answer might be that we hunt rabbits with dogs. This answer is based on how one uses things rather than on some idea of general similarities. The second line of argument that Pinker adduces is based on the studies of remote Russian peasants. The peasants were systematically interviewed to look for differences between concrete reasoning and hypothetical reasoning. A couple of examples from a large number of such interviews will show the distinction. Here's the first example. The question, what do a fish and a crow have in common? The answer, a fish lives in water, a crow flies. If a fish lies just on top of the water, a crow would peck at it. A crow can eat a fish, but a fish can't eat a crow. Question, could you use just one word for them both, such as animals? If you call them animals, that wouldn't be right. A fish isn't an animal, and a crow isn't either. A person can eat a fish, but not a crow. These answers are concrete and based on utility. There is no forming of groups of similar things. Now, the second example from Pinker shows that the respondents rejected a purely hypothetical mode of thinking. Here's the first question. All bears are white, except where there is always snow. In Novaya Zemlya, there is always snow. What color are the bears there? Answer, I have seen only black bears, and I do not talk of what I have not seen. Question, but what do my words imply? If a person has not been there, he cannot say anything on the basis of words. If a man was 60 or 80 and had seen a white bear there and told me about it, he could be believed. And here you can see there's an apparent inability to use hypothetical reasoning to answer what-if questions. Such answers, of course, would lead to very poor performances in current IQ tests. Such tests, as Pinker puts it, test abstract formal reasoning, the ability to detach oneself from parochial knowledge of one's own little world and explore the implication of postulates in purely hypothetical worlds. Questions like, if this, then what? Like the bear question. It's pretty obvious that the difference arises from the introduction of mass education. Education encourages the move from concrete operations to hypothetical operations. the development of abstract thinking goes along with post-scientific thinking. And this change to post-scientific or rational thinking is what Pinker calls the escalator of reason. And he argues that once we step on that escalator of reason, it leads on almost inevitably to a different kind of society. This new kind of society is more just and more peaceable. I'm going to quote his summary of where the escalator of reason leads. It's from his Better Angels of Our Nature. A broader effect of the escalator of reason, albeit one with many stalls, reversals, and holdouts, is the movement away from tribalism, authority and purity in moral systems, and towards humanism, classical liberalism, autonomy, and human rights. A humanistic value system, which privileges human flourishing as the ultimate good, is a product of reason because it can be justified. It can be mutually agreed upon by any community of thinkers who value their own interests and are engaged in reasoned negotiation, whereas communal and authoritarian values are parochial to a tribe or hierarchy. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful. There's an awful lot in that quotation, and one could probably use it as the basis of a whole evening's discussion trying to unpack it. One of the key features of it, however, is that agreement is much more likely using this system. We learn to base our ideas on reality and discussion, and we learn to gradually eliminate inconsistencies in this way. And because arguments and conclusions are based in reality, they are independent of individuals' prejudices and preferences. In other words, it's very hard for us to have significantly different perceptions about real objects and how they behave. Abstract thinking means that we are able to distance ourselves from immediate concerns. We can think about those wider implications of our actions. We can use what Pinker calls an Olympian super-rational vantage point and consider one's own interests and another person's as equivalent. We can use it to reframe a question in a wider context, such as the development of individuals, the good of society and humankind, or the living things and the whole environment. You might note that Huxley is saying much the same thing from his evolutionary point of view. Now I want to take up the idea that we are social animals. We live in groups and we interact with other members of the group, and we continually modify our behavior into those other individuals. Some have even argued that managing the relationships within a group is the cause of the massive development of our brains. Here's your last little slide with any luck. There you go. This slide shows a series of ever-widening circles, one inside the other, representing the spread of connections. The smallest circle is oneself, the next is family, and our connections broaden out to include our friends, our community, all humanity, and finally the whole earth with all living things and our precious biosphere. Recognizing these connections means, as Pinker says, occupying another person's position and imagining his or her emotions as if they were one's own. Sometimes these are called the circles of empathy for that reason. So where to from here? What are the future implications for us and our society? The encouraging thing is that we can learn to think critically and to reason effectively, as Pinker demonstrated with the data on IQ. Given that it is possible to learn to think more effectively, I think we have an individual responsibility to do so. We could perhaps think of this as developing our user's manual for the brain. We can also learn to think more about these circles of connection and our relatedness to all other humans, other living things, and our environment. I think this means that societies need to put more value on education at all levels, because education emphasizes and develops particular ways of thinking. We need to introduce important ideas such as reasoning and critical thinking into all stages of education, and indeed into public discourse. And following Huxley, to include a proper understanding of biology, that is, a proper understanding of nature and ourselves. And in order to do this, education should develop the tools to enable individuals to think for themselves, to evaluate information, and to think about values, to think critically, and to argue clearly and logically. The ability to frame questions in terms of the greater good would also be a crucial part of this. Fact-based education is likely to be of decreasing value as time passes and new evidence and new ideas arise. In contrast, thinking skills, the better use of our wonderful brains, will have long-term benefits. Humans would have better problem-solving abilities and be better able to adapt to changing circumstances. No one argues now about the increasing rate of change in our society or about the variety of roles that individuals will have to play over a lifetime. Adaptability will be crucial to our survival. I have suggested that the significant changes to education are going to be a major part of the way we improve. We also need to consider how we are going to tackle the problems facing the world, which are on a global scale. Problems such as population increase, climate crisis, environmental degradation, antibiotic resistance, rapid development of vaccines in response to epidemics, and inequality. Now, it's obvious that no single country can solve these problems, and big business certainly is not going to. It's not sufficiently profitable. This means that only supranational organizations can muster the resources, both intellectual and financial, to deal with these global problems. We have a model for this in CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. It's an internationally funded cooperative with workers from scores of countries working together. I suggest that that's a model for the way forward in solving our global problems. I've tried to give an account in all this of what for me is a very satisfying, internally consistent view of our place in nature, and indeed the universe, based on our best knowledge. I argue with Julian Huxley that the alternative to existential despair in the face of vastness and the indifference of the universe is to look at our own lives and our own world on an evolutionary scale. The recognition that evolution on this planet is up to us is empowering. If we are the only species capable, at least in principle, of regulating our environment in a deliberate, conscious way, then we have the responsibility to get on with it. Failure to do so might be fatal. At the same time, the evolutionary view makes the best value of the individual human being of the highest importance. We should organize our world as best we can to maximize the potential for all individuals, because all individuals have value and the potential to contribute to the development of a better life. Finally, I'm aware that some people may be thinking, all this reason and science are all very well, but they are not everything. So I'll end with some words from Huxley that might show that he had a wider, warmer, and more optimistic perspective than you might surmise. Recall that for him, the important conclusion from evolution was that mankind is the sole agent for the future evolution of this planet. He also said, if this seems bleak, excuse me, he said, if this seems bleak, consider the qualities we can bring, all the possibilities of wonder and knowledge, of delight and reverence, of creative belief and moral purpose, of passionate effort and embracing love, a rational, knowledge-based imagination and cooperative goodwill, or in the recent words of Barack Obama, we can do better. Thank you. The end. Thank you too. You're very kind. Thank you.
I worry, Alan, you have your mic unmuted. I worry that my internet has gone to the point where people might not be able to hear me. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
There's a smidge of breakup, but you're all right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully others are hearing me okay. Thanks so much for that. That's a brilliant presentation, exactly as we expected. I had a quick look at the chat function, and Philip Newton commented that somebody like Trump only sees the first two circles from your diagram of concentric circles with a huge emphasis on the self. Jill Bell concurring. Ray was wondering, could you repeat your critique of Sapiens? It was gone before it had properly registered.
Oh, sorry, yes. He associates evolutionary humanism specifically with racist theories and the Holocaust. And he's just wrong about that, actually, but he does. And since he's published 1 million copies of this book and still selling, and still is listed as one of the books of the decade, so it's still selling plenty. I think it's impossible to swim against that tide. So that's why I'm using it. He doesn't understand humanism. Everything he says about humanism, practically in the book, it's not much, but almost all of it is just wrong. Is that okay?
And why is he so popular, Alan?
It's a good book. It's a very good book. He just doesn't know anything about humanism. Very interesting book, yeah. We used it for our humanist community book club, and it was terrific. We got great mileage out. We used 2 sessions on it. It's a big book, but it's got great ideas in it.
Okay. Does anybody? People can draw my attention, I suppose, to themselves. What's that, Alan?
Patter.
Oh, Patter. Is it Patter Conroy? Is it? See, I'm having trouble seeing the screens here. My bandwidth seems to be struggling. Patter, go on ahead there.
Okay, hello Eamon, and hello Alan, and hello everybody, and thanks very much indeed, Alan, for that fabulous talk on evolution and humanism. There were a few things that were coming to mind as you were going through Pinter there towards the end, and it's very close to my own heart as well. And this whole notion of the advancement of IQ with the increase of education over the last couple of 100 years or so on. And one of the things that's sometimes disappointing is that although IQ is increasing, it's what we're using the IQ for. And the idea that maybe, I often think that in my own experience, about 3/4 of the population is using their IQ in the concrete all the time, and only maybe 1/4 is using it in the ideas, where things can change and develop. And when you consider the idea of the escalator of reason, that that education will lead to the advancement of higher function, and then you look at some of the societies, and you look at the events of the last 2 weeks in the United States and throughout the world, where we have people who have had quite a lot of education, quite a lot of exposure to ideas, and they are doing the most incredibly damaging things, and not seeming to understand the humanist aspect as quite separate from the idea of humanism, but the effect that they are having on the human population of the world. So I'm questioning a little bit the idea of the escalator of reason taking us to the advancement of higher function. And I think it's frustrating for a small proportion of the population, but an awful lot of them seem to be going with the contrary and using their increasing IQ for more basic function, such as greed and accumulation of material wealth and generating weapons of war and generating conflict and rivalry and so on. And a couple of years ago, I took the opportunity to drive across the United States from east to west. And it's quite shocking the amount of poverty that's in a country that's often lauded as well off or prosperous. You find there's a lot of poverty, and a lot of these people appear to be voting for ideas that are very contrary to the advancement of higher function. So I just wanted to make that point and raise that question with you as to what you think about the application of Pinter's ideas to modern society as we find it. Thank you.
Thank you. A number of thoughts have been, while I've been preparing this, I've had quite a lot of ideas prepared, and I've got lots of electronic pieces of paper with, go away and think about this for a week, you know, and we'll probably offer them as talks to humanist groups who won't escape. And certainly the failure of perhaps the majority of people to use their skills, the capacity of their brains, like on the Stephen Fry principle, they're using about 10% of their brain, whereas they could be thinking about other things. But then to what extent has education encouraged us to do that, and encouraged us to think about the circles of connection, and to think about, you know, if I do this, what are the consequences? I remember that the nearest thing I remember getting that at school would be, what if everybody did that? Actually quite a good question. You know, it's usually said in relation to dropping litter or something trivial, relatively trivial. Although, of course, on a scale we drop litter as a species now, it's now a very critical matter, because everybody is doing that. So it's, I think it's a very important idea. How can we get more people to use more of their brain and to evaluate things? Because the optimistic view, and I think humanism is essentially an optimistic set of ideas, is that if they're showing the way to do it, they will improve, and their better natures will come forward, will come to the fore. I like to think that's the case. And I suspect in a lot of discussions we come back to education. And in that point of view, it's going to be the last of the great battlefields in this country. Abortion will be as nothing compared to education, I suspect, as a battlefield. Just to touch on one thing you mentioned, though, Pada, it is the case that the United States of America is the only Western country where inequality is increasing.
Yes.
It's a very unequal society. Somebody else in another book, which I won't mention because I'll have to alter my handout, observes that the middle classes are actually quite a threatened group, because they're based on income, and their jobs are threatened by automation of various kinds.
Yes.
And somebody mentioned with the discussion with the North Coast humanists last night, that in the States you get queues of people in big cars queuing up at food banks. They've got huge cars, big houses, but they've got no income because they're out of work. And so it's a very vulnerable society, as we see.
It is, and I don't want to hog it or anything now, but also the people who are on Capitol Hill are all well-educated people in the traditional sense of education, and they've all come through some of the Ivy League colleges of the United States, where they should have been exposed to ideas and you know, rational thinking, but they seem to be in their silos to a terrible extent, and it's worrying, you know. But I do agree with you 100% that the big battle for the future is not in how much education people get, but the quality of the education, and going away from dogmatizing youngsters into developing their rational thinking.
Well, I think the problem in the States particularly, but it may not be you, and here I'm showing my 1960s Pinko credentials, is that they have a ruling elite, in effect, in the States. And any old billionaire can become president in the United States of America. And in the UK. And you have a ruling elite in the UK as well. People who went to half a dozen elite public schools, very expensive educations, and their whole society and values are based on wealth, not on income. They don't care about jobs. It doesn't affect them. Losing the job isn't important. It's wealth creation. And most of wealth creation, you could argue, is spurious anyway. So there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Alan.
Keith Thompson said he had a question that follows on from Patter's comments, and then might go to Jamie Smith, who typed up a very interesting question earlier, but it's been waiting a while to ask it. So Keith Thompson, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Damon. Yeah, it kind of follows on a little bit from what Pader was saying, Alan. And it's about education. You were mentioning Pinker's suggestion that we're moving from a fact-based education style to a more critical reasoning, reflection-based one. But I wonder, is there, maybe just to put a spanner in the works and put a critique on that, two historians, Timothy Snyder and Tony Judd, wrote a wonderful book in the 20th century, where they talked about how education systems in the last 30, 40 years have moved away from fact-based narrative, in particular history teaching. It's moved away from narrative history, especially in places like the US and the UK. And what you get then is everyone's a critic. And if everyone's a critic, there's no actual, I suppose, standard story that we're telling, so that there's no fact-based that we can all agree on. And so what you get is people like Trump, because they can manipulate the narrative. They can say, oh no, it was like this, or something like that. And they can get themselves more power as a result. So is there an element that actually a more critical, reason-based education system is not enough, that we still actually need, as an educator yourself, I suppose, we still need a very factual-based element, core to it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you need to know which way is up, all right. You know, there are kind of things you have to know. The narrative story, and I think it's a very telling point you have there, and I hadn't heard it in that version. The thing is, what happens is, if there are different narratives, you could say, my narrative is as good as your narrative. My theory is as good as your theory. Experts don't count. Now, we've seen a bit of a swing the other way in the recent past, but we've also seen, of course, in Trump's America, the dismissal of experts, the continued dismissal of experts. I mean, they've never really been there very long. If the story doesn't suit, then you get rid of them. So, yeah, that's an anti-intellectual approach. You've probably all seen the T-shirt that says, "You can have your own ideas, but you can't have your own facts. You have to agree on some facts to start with." So there are a lot going on there. There's all sorts of flashing up things going on. Yeah.
Right. Jamie Smith, do you want to ask your question that you typed it up there maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago, but apologies now only getting to you.
Sure. Yeah, I was just interested, Alan, if you, I guess, the circles of connection or empathy felt to me really relevant to the whole Black Lives Matters movement going on at the moment. And beyond that movement, I guess, where I was just thinking in terms of things like racism and things like that. Does it feel relevant to that slide as an example of when people don't engage with the full spectrum of them?
Yeah, othering, I think, is the term that's used in some areas. If you put people into different partitions, into different groups, they're not part of our group, so we can do what we like to them. Yeah. And that's essentially what happens. I mean, that's the story of the Holocaust. It's the story of genocide the world over. And it's the story of Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Don't Matter in some schools of thought, perhaps. Yeah, so I see a continuum between the biological connectedness to that social connectedness. I see the two things are, we are related to bacteria. They're a long way away from us. They're not very like us, but you ain't going to get very far without them. In fact, if one cell hadn't taken in a useful bacterium, God knows how many billion years ago, we wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be any complex organisms at all doing the hard work. So they're all, and the circles of connection is very much, I see that as part of that. We're connected to all species, but we're connected to all humans and to our environment. An expression, the web of life, which goes back to the 18th century, actually, the connectedness of the whole ecological story is part of what we are, and we have disregarded it for the most part rather badly over the last 200 years. Can I just say that that diagram, the circles of connection, not quite in that form, goes back about 2,000 years. And if you like to quote an ancient Greek to make your views respectable, his name was Hierocles, and he produced this circles of connection. And the Stoics used it, and all sorts of other philosophers used it too. So there you are. I'm glad I got him in.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Alan. Just to remind people, if they're not looking at the chat function, basically I can no longer see people's video images, so I can't see if you have your hand up. So just type the word question into the chat function. You'll get my attention, and I'll put you on the list of people who are looking to get in. Gary, you had a question there about religion and the development of critical thinking. Want to unmute yourself and?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Alan, do you think religion has, like I see a lot of parallels in religion and social media in terms of limiting critical thinking. Do you think religion has a lot to answer for in that regard?
Sorry, say again. I was trying to find you on the screen there, and you speaker view's not working.
Yeah.
Just say again.
Yeah.
Religion. Do
you think religion has a lot to answer for in terms of dissuading people from engaging in critical thinking?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Religions don't want people to think critically. They want them to accept, and they're also very much about othering. Anybody who's not in our religious group is the enemy. They're not part of us, and many religions, or many parts of many religions, say we can exterminate them ad lib, just as we encounter them. And some religions say that it is your duty to go out and bump off if you don't share your set. So I think they do have a lot to answer for, and the whole idea of faith is absolutely inimical to critical thinking. You will believe something because somebody tells you it, and that's it. I don't think so. Sorry, I'm not going there.
No, I read there recently that there's a pattern in England. More and more middle-class parents are deciding to send their kids to Catholic schools because they think, even though they're not believers themselves, they think it gives them the best chance of actually succeeding in society currently, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, there are some very good religious schools. There are apparently some shockers as well, but yeah, and some religious schools are nice middle-class schools with lots of nice middle-class children and middle-class parents. So we want our little boys and girls to go there. Fine, that's a social thing. Again, my 1960s on Reconstruction, I think there should have been a whole system of heavily financed comprehensive schools, all the same all across the country, with all the resources they need to get on with it, and being devoid of religion. But that's not where we're at, and certainly not in this country, of course, as we know all too well, with, 97% of national schools, except they don't like to call them that, national schools are controlled by religious, with very variable consequences for that. And I think that's just wrong, and we just have to get rid of that. I suspect I'm not going to live to see that, but that's the way we've got to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Willie Sweeney, you're up next.
Good evening, all. What I was thinking of how all the various different oppressions militates against us, our development, and the notion of privilege often stops us from wanting to eradicate oppression. Maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, just go on and just say a bit more about that. In what sense does privilege?
Well, I think sometimes when we're in a position of privilege, that we don't realize the struggles of others.
Yes, I think that's certainly the case. And the more, of course, that only applies to people who are much more privileged than I am. I don't do this. Yes, I think there's a certain selfish regard that says, I don't want to jeopardize my position. Now, I am, of course, an extremely virtuous person, and I have absolutely no objection to being taxed at a higher level in order to eliminate poverty in this country. Yeah, now that's very virtuous, and of course I can easily say it because it's probably not going to happen anyway. But it seems to me that's what should be happening. We shouldn't tolerate vast inequalities in our society. It's dangerous, apart from inhumane. It leads to instability and all sorts of other nasty things. So we're much better to mind people. I'm in danger of encroaching on Eamon's talk next month, which he hasn't said he's doing, but he is, I think.
Unless we get a better suggestion or a better idea, Alan.
Well, we won't get a better idea. You go ahead. I've got people lined up to come to it.
Well, speaking of future talks, maybe Janie, you mentioned earlier the upcoming South Dublin Humanist Community event. But there was a lot of people who will be in the room at the moment who weren't there when you were mentioning it. So maybe, do you want another chance to plug the event coming up on the 21st?
Okay, Eamon, thank you. Yes, on it's actually Sunday the 21st, with Thinking 7:30 start. And if anyone would like to join us and indeed make a contribution, it could be a poem, it could be a song, a piece of music, and we'll plan the evening. If they could make their submissions to South Dublin Humanist Community at gmail.com. And if they email us there, then we can also send them out the Zoom link for the meeting. I don't know if Ruth is on here. I know Barbara is as well.
Barbara is still here. Yeah, and Ruth is there as well, although I haven't seen her video working.
Okay. If I've forgotten anything, maybe they might like to jump in as well.
Sounds like you haven't forgotten anything then.
But no, we'd love everyone, anyone and everyone to join us if they're welcome. If they'd like to, they'd be very welcome.
Excellent. Thanks a million, Janie. So does anybody else have a question or a comment they'd like to ask or make? And again, apologies, I can't see any hands. Alan, perhaps you can spot somebody who...
Yeah, Bridget's there.
Okay, Bridget, fire ahead.
You're muted. You're muted, darlings. Unmute. Take a deep breath and off you go.
Yes. No, I was trying to type stuff because I don't want to. I know I took up time earlier, but they were going privately to Dara, so I apologize, Dara. But when you were talking about Steven Pinker and the Russian peasants, it was just striking. I actually missed a lot of what came immediately after that because I was going off on my own thoughts. Yeah. It struck me as being pretty reductive, actually, because I was thinking that all human beings from aeons back have used riddles, jokes, and puzzles, which is abstract thinking, and I cannot believe that Russian peasants are exempted from that. So
That's an interesting idea.
It struck me as being a little, and then of course I was going on thinking of jokes and things and not listening to what you were saying at all, for which I apologise. Can I tell you one of the jokes that sprung to mind, because I think it's dead good, but nobody else does. What do you call two guys hiding behind a helmet?
No.
Curtain rod.
Oh, curtain rod. Very good. Thank you.
Nobody's laughing.
They're all having a good laugh.
You have to explain the joke to us.
They're laughing now.
Curtain rod.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. I got it.
Expecting, Bridget, that you would have a comment to make about the Russian peasants. But I wasn't expecting that one. I was expecting an entirely different one. And that's a really interesting idea. And the idea of riddles really touches a chord with me, because in my time, as I've probably bored most of you by saying, I've studied Old English, and there's the Exeter Book of Riddles and all of that. So that's a huge part of that very small corpus. So yes, you're right. That is about similarities and abstract notions. But it's a question, I suppose, of where you apply them. and how you think about them. In relation to the second of the questions that they asked, the one of the hypothetical thinking about the bears, that's very much part of many ancient cultures that a lot of languages, well, not a lot, some of the languages I know or know of have a particular way of speaking that distinguishes between something I have seen and something I am telling you somebody else said. Just as in that example, then you could believe him. You could believe him. Not you will believe him, you could believe him. So you might believe it. And this goes right back, quote another Greek, I suppose, good old Herodotus, the father of history, the first serious history. He distinguishes all the way through there the things he has seen himself and the things he has not seen himself. It's critical to that narrative in that almost pre-literate time. So it's a very fundamental sort of idea that you can't really believe what people tell you. Yeah.
But it's that thing about puzzles, mazes.
Yeah. I shall take that away and think about it.
Yeah. Shall I tell you another joke? What cheese would you use to lure a bear out of a tree?
What cheese?
Cheese.
Oh, cheese. Oh, no, I don't know.
Come on, bear.
Oh, very good. That's good. That's good.
Actually, I'm going to steal that. It wasn't a bad joke.
That's a good joke. It's good.
Yes.
So is Colonel.
There, yeah, well done. Well done, Bridget. Good.
Right. I'm pinching that one. Just what
I feel obliged to mute Bridget at this point. Does anybody fancy the honor of the last comment or question? And again, my bandwidth is so poor, Alan, you might have to do the chairing on this one.
You're right. I'm just scrolling through the gallery just in case anybody wants a last shout. Waving there. There's Ray is waving.
Yeah, it was interesting you were talking about education and its link with improvement in thinking, so abstract thinking. And I was thinking about, is education inequality increasing in some societies? You know, is there a widening gap between the kind of education that the elite get and the not so fortunate?
Yes, I suppose it depends where you're thinking of, but yes, I think in general, and certainly thinking of the UK and thinking of the US, yes, because you have this wealthy, privileged elite who have that particular cultural education, I suspect, and the rest, and in our present circumstances, which we've managed not to mention so far, very good. I think the inequalities in our society are being magnified in relation to education with this online tuition from schools. It's grand. If you've got a house that's big enough for you to have a quiet space and you've got a laptop for every child in the house and the broadband to go with it. But if you haven't, and there's nowhere for you to sit and be quiet and study, then those inequalities are being magnified over and over again. And the nice middle classes are getting away with it and they can manage. But those who are not in that position are going to struggle even more. And I don't know how we're going to pick those up. So I think it's a serious risk. And I can't tack the inequality onto my list, the end of my list of global problems. In fact, I only added it yesterday. And it actually probably is right up there with climate change or climate crisis and pandemics, I think. Yeah. We've got all those things. It's nice having the gallery view on. I can see all these lovely people who are here now. I couldn't see them before.
And don't forget the unlovely ones as well, Alan.
Yeah, sure. Lots of chums, including some from North Coast. I see a couple. That's good. Yeah.
And unless there's somebody who's jumping up and down there to ask the last question, we might call an official end to it. We're not going anywhere. You can hang around for.
Yeah, we're going to the pub.
Going to the virtual pub. Alan wants to.
Go to the virtual pub, yeah, I don't see any hands waving.
Okay.
So I think we
call a halt to proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for coming. At one point we had 71 attendees, and Alan, you've managed to hold on to most of them for the entire duration.
Great.
Thank you very much. You're wonderful.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
Fascinating material, brilliantly delivered, as we've all come to expect from Alan. And, we all show our appreciation for our guest this evening, our speaker.
Thank you, Alan. When you have when you have no one else asking questions, you know you have given a good presentation.
As long as somebody asks a question, otherwise you've lost them all.
No.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Alan.
People would like me to email them Alan's handout, which he promised. Just give me a shout on events@humanism.ie. And
I might even get it to you tonight.
Yeah. And our next event is next month. Bridget Carlin will be doing a stand-up comedy slot on Zoom.
Followed by jokes.
I'm washing my hair that evening.
We won't be washing mine. It doesn't take that long.
Details to follow about the next event. We'll pick an evening. We'll finalise the subject, and we'll contact you all. And if you're not a member of the Humanist Association yet, email me at events@humanism.ie. I'll make sure that you're kept informed about upcoming seminars like this. So again, thanks again, Alan, and thanks everybody for coming.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. You're stars. I'm staying here and having a drink.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.